Hi, I'm Linda. A few months ago, my life changed in ways I never saw coming, and not in a good way. At first, I thought I had everything I ever wanted: a new marriage to Michael, a man I deeply loved, and a fresh start with his family, including his son, Jake. But what seemed like a dream quickly turned into a nightmare. The first time I noticed something strange, I told myself I was imagining things. You know how you can talk yourself into believing things are fine when they're really not? That was me. I ignored the subtle glances, the compliments that felt off. I chalked it up to Jake just being friendly. He was 18, polite, a little awkward, typical for his age, right? But one evening, he said something I couldn't ignore. It all started a few weeks after Michael and I got married. We were settling into our routines, blending our lives together. Michael worked long hours as a corporate attorney, and I'd taken on the challenge of adjusting to my new role as his wife, and Jake's stepmother. Jake had just turned 18, fresh out of high school. He had that mix of confidence and uncertainty young men have when they're on the brink of adulthood. At first, we got along well. He was polite, helpful even. He'd offer to help carry groceries, clean up after dinner, or fix little things around the house. But then, it started to feel different. One evening, we were all watching a movie together. Michael had fallen asleep on the couch, and Jake and I were still awake. During a quiet moment in the film, Jake leaned over and whispered, "You're way too young and beautiful to be with my dad, you know." I froze. It was a compliment, technically, but the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. I laughed it off, awkwardly, and said, "That's sweet, Jake, but your dad's a great man." He smiled, but it wasn't the innocent kind. It was knowing. I told myself I was reading too much into it. He was a teenager, probably just being awkward, trying to make conversation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Over the next few weeks, Jake's behavior escalated in subtle ways. He always seemed to find excuses to be near me. If I was cooking, he'd suddenly need to grab something from the kitchen. If I was folding laundry, he'd sit on the counter, chatting about random things. Then came the touches. At first, they were small. A hand brushing against mine when I handed him a plate. A hand on my shoulder when he leaned in to look at my laptop screen. But they felt deliberate, like they lasted just a second too long. One afternoon, I was unpacking groceries when he came up behind me to help. His hands brushed against mine as he took a bag, and I instinctively stepped back. "Thanks, Jake, but I've got it," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Just trying to be helpful," he replied, grinning. But there was something in his tone that made my stomach tighten. I kept telling myself it was all in my head. Jake was just being friendly, right? He was young, inexperienced. Maybe he didn't realize how his actions came across. But then, something happened that I couldn't ignore. We were hosting a small family dinner. Michael had invited a few of his colleagues over, and the house was bustling with conversation and laughter. I was in the kitchen, plating appetizers, when I felt someone watching me. I turned around, and there was Jake, leaning against the doorway, staring. Not in a casual way, his gaze was intense, unsettling. "What is it?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "You're just really good at this," he said, gesturing to the food. But his tone suggested he wasn't talking about my cooking. Before I could respond, Michael walked in, and Jake quickly straightened up, flashing his usual charming smile. "Need help with anything, Dad?" he asked, as if nothing had happened. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jake's face, his stare, his words replaying in my mind. Was I imagining things? Or was there something darker at play? The next day, things got even stranger. I was folding laundry in the living room when Jake walked in, holding his phone. "Hey, Linda, can I show you something?" he asked. I hesitated. "Sure," I said cautiously. He sat down beside me, too close. On the screen was a meme, something funny and harmless, but as I laughed politely, he leaned in. "You know, I feel like you get me," he said softly. "Like, really get me." "Jake," I said, standing up quickly, "I think you're reading too much into things." He looked up at me, his face serious. "Am I?" At that moment, I realized I couldn't keep brushing this off. Jake wasn't just being awkward or overly friendly. There was an undertone to his words and actions that felt intentional. But what could I do? If I brought it up to Michael, would he even believe me? I told myself I'd keep my distance, set clear boundaries, and hope Jake would back off. But deep down, I knew this was far from over. And trust me, what happened next? It changed everything. Stay with me, because the twists you're about to hear will leave you speechless. The first time I caught Jake staring at me, I brushed it off. I told myself he was just a teenager, probably zoning out or lost in his thoughts. But as the days passed, those moments started to pile up. One morning, I was in the kitchen making coffee, wearing my usual oversized sweater and yoga pants, nothing special. I felt eyes on me and turned around. There he was, leaning against the doorway, holding his cereal bowl like he'd been standing there for a while. "Morning, Jake," I said, trying to keep things casual. "You always look so put together," he replied, his eyes not leaving mine. Even first thing in the morning. It was a compliment, sure, but the way he said it made me feel exposed, like I was on display. I laughed awkwardly and turned back to the coffee maker. My heart was racing, though I couldn't explain why. That was the moment I realized this wasn't normal. And it wasn't going away. It wasn't just the staring. Jake always found excuses to be near me. If I was folding laundry, he'd suddenly appear with a joke or a random question. If I was cooking, he'd offer to chop vegetables, even though he'd never shown any interest in cooking before. And then there were the compliments. "You have really pretty eyes," he'd say, out of nowhere. Or, "That dress looks amazing on you." Michael thought it was sweet. "He's just warming up to you," he'd say with a chuckle when I mentioned how attentive Jake was. He's always been a little shy with new people. But this wasn't shyness. And it definitely wasn't innocent. One evening, Michael was working late, and Jake and I were home alone. I was tidying up the living room when Jake came in, carrying his laptop. "Hey, Linda," he said, sitting on the couch. "Can I show you something?" "Sure," I replied, though I was already on edge. He pulled up a photo of a beach sunset, something he said he wanted to paint. I nodded, trying to focus on the screen instead of how close he was sitting. "You're so easy to talk to," he said suddenly, his voice softer. I froze. "Thanks, Jake," I said, standing up quickly and putting some distance between us. "That's really nice of you to say." He didn't move. "It's true," he said. "I feel like you understand me better than anyone else." I forced a smile and changed the subject, but inside, I felt like I was walking a tightrope. One wrong move, and I'd fall into something I couldn't climb out of. The next morning, I decided I needed to set boundaries. I couldn't let this go on, for both our sakes. But Jake had other plans. As I was getting ready to leave the house, he appeared in the hallway, leaning casually against the wall. "Heading out?" he asked, his tone light. "Just running errands," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Mind if I come along? I could use some fresh air." It wasn't unusual for him to want to tag along, but this time, I made an excuse. "I'm just going to the grocery store," I said. Nothing exciting. He didn't press further, but his expression told me he wasn't happy. Later that evening, things took an even stranger turn. I was sitting on the patio, enjoying a quiet moment, when Jake came out and sat beside me. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice unusually serious. "Sure," I replied cautiously. "Do you think people can control who they're attracted to?" I felt my stomach drop. "Jake, that's a complicated question," I said, keeping my tone light. "Attraction isn't something we can always control, but how we act on it is what matters." He nodded, his gaze fixed on me. "You're right," he said, almost to himself. "But sometimes, it feels impossible to ignore." I stood up, my heart pounding. "It's getting late," I said, brushing off his comment. "We should head inside." He didn't argue, but the way he looked at me as I walked away left me feeling unsettled, like I'd just crossed an invisible line without realizing it. By now, I knew I couldn't keep this to myself much longer. I wanted to talk to Michael, but how could I? Jake was his son. What if he didn't believe me? What if he thought I was the one making things awkward? And yet, the more I ignored Jake's behavior, the bolder he became. He'd find ways to brush against me when passing by, his hand lingering on my shoulder or arm just a little too long. One day, while I was cleaning the kitchen, he walked up behind me and placed his hand on my back. "Let me help," he said. "I've got it," I replied, stepping away. He smiled, but there was something in his eyes that made my skin crawl. That evening, as I lay in bed next to Michael, I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head. Was I overreacting? Or was Jake's behavior as deliberate as it felt? I needed to make a decision. Either I confronted Jake directly, or I told Michael the truth. But I couldn't keep living like this, waiting for the next unsettling comment or touch. What I didn't realize was that Jake had already taken things to the next level. And what happened next? It's something I'll never forget. Stay with me, because the twists that are coming will leave you speechless. You won't believe where this story is headed. That evening, I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, trying to shake off the unease that had become all too familiar. Michael was upstairs, catching up on emails, and the house was eerily quiet. I thought I had a moment to myself, until Jake walked in. "Linda," he said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. He sat down on the other end of the couch, but somehow, the space between us felt non-existent. "Yes?" I replied, keeping my eyes on my phone, pretending to be engrossed. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his tone almost accusatory. I froze for a second, then forced a smile. "Avoiding you? Don't be silly. I've just been busy." "You don't have to lie," he said, leaning forward. "I can tell when you're uncomfortable." His words sent a chill down my spine. Was he trying to gaslight me? Or was he daring me to confront him? Either way, the conversation was heading somewhere dangerous, and I needed to stop it. "Jake, I think you're imagining things," I said, standing up. "It's late. You should get some sleep." He didn't move. Instead, he said something that made my heart stop. "You know, it's okay to feel something for me. I won't tell anyone." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My hands were trembling as I turned to look at him. He was smiling, a smug, knowing smile that sent a wave of anger and fear through me. I didn't sleep that night. Jake's words echoed in my head, over and over. I knew I couldn't keep quiet any longer. I needed to tell Michael. But how could I explain something so twisted without it sounding unbelievable? The next morning, I decided to ease into the conversation. As Michael sipped his coffee, I said, "Have you noticed anything different about Jake lately?" Michael raised an eyebrow. "Different? How?" "I don't know," I said, choosing my words carefully. "He seems more intense. Especially around me." Michael chuckled. "He's 18, Linda. Boys that age are intense about everything. Give him some space, and he'll settle down." I wanted to scream. How could he not see it? But I knew pressing too hard would only make me seem paranoid. Jake, of course, wasn't oblivious. That afternoon, he cornered me in the hallway, his smirk bolder than ever. "Talking to Dad about me?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied, trying to move past him, but he blocked my way. "You should be careful," he said, his tone suddenly serious. "You wouldn't want him thinking you're making things up." It was a threat, plain and simple. And it worked. I felt trapped, like I was walking a tightrope that Jake controlled. The next few days were a nightmare. Jake's behavior became even more brazen. He'd leave little notes on my nightstand when Michael wasn't looking. "You looked beautiful today. I can't stop thinking about you." Each one made my skin crawl, but I couldn't bring myself to show them to Michael. What if Jake denied everything? Worse, what if Michael believed him? Then, one evening, Jake took things too far. I was in the laundry room, folding clothes, when he walked in and shut the door behind him. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm but unnerving. "There's nothing to talk about," I replied, keeping my distance. "Come on, Linda," he said, stepping closer. "I know you feel it too." I couldn't take it anymore. "Stop it, Jake." I snapped. "This isn't funny. This isn't normal." For a moment, he looked genuinely shocked. But then his expression shifted into something darker. "If you tell Dad," he said slowly, "I'll make sure he thinks you're the one coming on to me." My heart sank. He'd thought this through, hadn't he? He knew exactly how to manipulate the situation to his advantage. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let Jake control me any longer. I started documenting everything, the notes, the comments, the way he cornered me. I even set up my phone to record audio whenever I was alone with him. I knew it was risky. If Jake found out, things could escalate. But I also knew it was the only way to prove the truth. The breaking point came during a family dinner. Michael was telling a story about work when Jake interrupted him, turning the conversation toward me. "Linda's been spending a lot of time in the garden lately," Jake said, his tone casual but loaded. "She says it helps her relax." Michael smiled. "That's great. Gardening is good for the soul." Jake smirked. "I guess that's why she looks so radiant lately." The room went silent. Michael looked confused, but I could feel the tension radiating from Jake. He was testing me, seeing how far he could push. I stood up, my hands shaking. "Excuse me," I said, heading for the kitchen. I needed a moment to collect myself before I did something I'd regret. What happened next is something I'll never forget. Jake followed me into the kitchen, his smirk replaced by a look of triumph. "You can't ignore me forever," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But this time, I was ready. "You're right," I said, pulling out my phone. "I can't." I pressed play, and Jake's own words filled the room. The recordings I'd made over the past week were clear and damning. His face paled. You recorded me?" "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "And now, we're going to talk to your father. Together." This is where things really start to unravel. What Jake does next will shock you, and the truth about his motives. It's even darker than I imagined. You won't believe where this story is headed. Stay tuned. You'd think confronting Jake with the recordings would be the end of it, right? That after hearing his own voice, he'd back off, maybe even apologize. But what happened next was far from anything I could have predicted. Jake didn't crumble under the weight of the evidence. Instead, he smirked, leaned back against the kitchen counter, and said, "Do you really think this changes anything?" I stared at him, trying to understand his confidence. "Michael will hear this," I said, holding my phone tightly. "He'll know the truth." Jake shrugged, his nonchalance chilling. "You're assuming he'll believe you. You're assuming I haven't prepared for this." That was the moment I realized I was up against something much darker than I had anticipated. Jake wasn't just an impulsive teenager with a misguided crush. He was calculated, manipulative, and disturbingly self-assured. I didn't give him the satisfaction of responding. I walked straight to Michael's office, my heart pounding. He looked up from his desk, surprised to see me. "Linda, what's wrong?" he asked, setting his glasses down. I didn't waste time. "You need to hear this," I said, hitting play on my phone. As Jake's voice filled the room, Michael's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. When the recording ended, there was a long silence. "Tell me this is some kind of joke," Michael finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not," I said, my voice trembling. "This is what I've been dealing with. This is why I've been so distant." Michael leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. I don't know what to say. This doesn't sound like Jake." That's when Jake appeared in the doorway. How long had he been standing there? His timing was impeccable, too perfect to be coincidence. "Dad," Jake said, his voice calm and composed. "I know how this looks, but you have to hear my side." Michael gestured for him to come in, his face a mixture of confusion and frustration. Jake turned to me, his expression one of faux sadness. "Linda, I didn't think you'd go this far. I know I've been trying to bond with you, maybe more than I should have, but to twist it into something like this?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're lying," I said, my voice rising. "You know exactly what you've been doing." Jake looked at Michael, his eyes welling up with tears. "Dad, she's been acting strange for weeks. Always avoiding me, always giving me these looks. I didn't want to say anything because I didn't want to cause trouble." Michael looked between us, his expression torn. "What are you saying, Jake?" Jake hesitated, as if it pained him to continue. "I think Linda might be misinterpreting things. Or worse, maybe she's projecting something onto me." It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Was Jake really trying to make me out to be the villain? And worse, was Michael actually considering it? "Michael, you can't seriously believe this," I said, my voice breaking. "I've been documenting everything. The notes, the comments, the way he—" "Show me the notes," Jake interrupted, his voice sharp. I froze. I hadn't brought them with me. They were upstairs, hidden in a drawer. Michael sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know what to think right now." "Jake, go to your room. Linda, we'll talk about this later." Jake nodded, giving me one last smug glance before leaving. That night, I locked myself in the bedroom, my mind racing. I couldn't believe what was happening. Jake had managed to plant a seed of doubt in Michael's mind, and I wasn't sure how to uproot it. Then, around midnight, I heard a faint tapping at the door. I froze, my heart pounding. "Linda," Jake whispered from the other side. "We need to talk." I didn't respond. Instead, I grabbed my phone and hit record. "Linda," he said again, his tone soft and almost pleading. "You're making this worse for yourself. Let me in, and we can figure this out." I stayed silent, my hand trembling as I held the phone. After a few moments, the tapping stopped, and I heard his footsteps retreating. The next morning, I showed Michael the new recording. He listened, his expression unreadable. "This doesn't prove anything," he said finally. "Michael, how much more proof do you need?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. He came to our bedroom door in the middle of the night. Michael sighed. "Linda, I don't know what to do. If Jake's lying, then he's been manipulating me for weeks. But if you're mistaken, or worse, if you're exaggerating." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The implication was clear. That evening, everything came to a head. I was in the kitchen when Jake walked in, his smugness replaced by something colder, more dangerous. "You're running out of time," he said, his voice low. "Michael's starting to question you. It's only a matter of time before he sides with me completely." I turned to face him, my fear replaced by a surge of anger. "You're not going to win, Jake. I'll make sure of it." He smirked. "Good luck with that." But then, something unexpected happened. Michael walked in, his face pale. He was holding one of the notes Jake had left for me, the one I thought I'd hidden safely. "Jake," Michael said, his voice trembling. "Explain this." For the first time, Jake looked genuinely rattled. "Dad, I don't know where you found that. It's not mine." Michael's gaze shifted to me, then back to Jake. Enough. I want the truth. Now. What Jake revealed next changed everything. But the story doesn't end here. The real twist is just around the corner, and trust me, you won't see it coming. Stay tuned. You won't believe what Jake said next. Just when I thought I had seen the full extent of his manipulation, he pulled a card I never saw coming, a revelation so shocking it left Michael and me speechless. Jake looked at his father, his eyes brimming with feigned innocence, and said, "Dad, I didn't want to tell you because I was afraid of what it would do to this family." But Linda, she kissed me. My heart stopped. The room spun. "No." I shouted, my voice shaking with disbelief. "That's a lie. You know that's a lie." Michael's face turned white, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "Jake, are you serious? This is a massive accusation." Jake nodded solemnly, his performance Oscar-worthy. "I didn't know how to handle it, Dad. I didn't want to hurt you or break up the family. But she's been making me feel uncomfortable for weeks." I couldn't believe my ears. The audacity, the cold-blooded calculation, it was beyond anything I'd imagined. "Michael, you know me," I said desperately, tears streaming down my face. "This is insane. He's lying to cover up everything he's done." Jake didn't miss a beat. "I'm sorry, Linda, but I can't let you manipulate Dad anymore. I have to tell the truth." Michael stood up abruptly, his face unreadable. "Both of you, stop." His voice was low, but it carried the weight of his authority. He turned to Jake. "If what you're saying is true, why didn't you come to me sooner?" Jake's answer was perfectly rehearsed. "I didn't want to hurt you. I thought maybe Linda would stop on her own. But when she started accusing me, I realized she was trying to cover her tracks. I couldn't take it anymore. Michael, please, you have to see through this. He's twisting everything to make himself look innocent." Michael raised a hand to silence me. "Enough, Linda. I need to think." The next few days were unbearable. Michael barely spoke to me, his mind clearly wrestling with the conflicting stories. Jake, on the other hand, walked around the house like he'd already won. His smirks, his smug glances, they were like daggers. But I wasn't about to give up. I knew I had to find concrete evidence, something so undeniable that even Jake couldn't talk his way out of it. That's when I remembered the cameras. Months ago, Michael had installed security cameras around the house for general safety. At the time, I didn't pay much attention to them. But now, I realized they might hold the key to proving my innocence. Late one night, while Michael and Jake were asleep, I accessed the footage from our home computer. My hands trembled as I scrolled through hours of video, searching for anything that could expose Jake's lies. And then, I found it. The footage was from a week ago. It showed Jake sneaking into the living room late at night. He carefully placed one of his cryptic notes on the coffee table, the same note he later claimed I had written. I kept watching, my heart pounding. In another clip, he stood outside my bedroom door, whispering something I couldn't hear but that sent chills down my spine. This was it. This was the proof I needed. The next morning, I showed Michael the footage. He watched in silence, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief. When the final clip ended, he turned to me, his eyes filled with regret. "Linda, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I should have believed you." Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a new question. What are we going to do about Jake? Michael confronted Jake that evening. The boy who had been so smug, so confident, finally cracked under the pressure. He stammered, tried to deny the footage, but there was no escaping the truth. "I just wanted you to notice me," Jake finally shouted, his facade crumbling. "Ever since Linda came into our lives, you've been so focused on her that you forgot about me." Michael looked at his son with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "Jake, I love you. But what you've done is unacceptable. You've hurt this family in ways I don't know if we can recover from. Jake stormed out of the house that night, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. But it was short-lived. A few days later, Michael received a call from Jake's mother, his ex-wife, Susan. She was hysterical, claiming Jake had told her a completely different version of events. According to him, I had manipulated both him and Michael, driving a wedge into their family. It was clear Jake wasn't done. This story doesn't end with Jake leaving. The final twist is something you'll have to see to believe. Because what came next changed everything, for me, for Michael, and for Jake. Stay tuned. You won't want to miss this. You think the worst has already happened? Think again. Just when I believed I was free from Jake's web of lies, he proved that his manipulation ran even deeper than I imagined. And the shocking truth left me questioning everything, including my own instincts. It all started a week after Jake stormed out. I thought we were finally moving toward healing. Michael and I were talking again, rebuilding trust one conversation at a time. But then, a strange package arrived at our doorstep. Inside was a flash drive. No note, no explanation, just a plain black USB stick. My stomach twisted with unease. Michael and I exchanged wary glances. Do we open it? I asked. Michael hesitated but nodded. We need to know. The contents of the drive were horrifying. It was a collection of emails and screenshots, fake, but disturbingly convincing. They painted a picture of me pursuing Jake, obsessing over him, even threatening him when he didn't reciprocate. Michael's face darkened as he scrolled through the files. This can't be real, he muttered. It's not, I said firmly, but my voice wavered. Michael, you know me. You know I would never do this. I want to believe you, he said, his voice strained. But this looks so damning. What if he's not lying? The words hit me like a slap. After everything, Michael was still doubting me. I knew I had to act fast. If Jake was willing to go this far, there was no telling what he'd do next. I decided to reach out to someone I never thought I'd turn to, Jake's mother, Susan. Susan was reluctant to meet at first. She had always been cold toward me, seeing me as a younger replacement for her in Michael's life. But when I explained that it was about Jake, she agreed. Over coffee at a quiet diner, I laid everything out. I didn't hold back. Susan listened, her expression shifting from skepticism to something resembling concern. I've seen Jake lie before, she admitted. But never like this. Are you sure he's behind it? I nodded. Susan, he's not the same boy you think he is. He's manipulative, calculated. He's tearing this family apart. To my surprise, Susan sighed heavily. I believe you. With Susan on my side, I felt a glimmer of hope. She offered to confront Jake herself, believing she could get through to him in a way Michael or I couldn't. But before she had the chance, Jake made his next move. That evening, Michael received a phone call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end claimed to be a private investigator. The man said he had evidence of my infidelity, not with Jake, but with someone else entirely. It was absurd, but it was also dangerous. Jake was escalating, and he was dragging my reputation through the mud in the process. I grabbed the phone from Michael and demanded answers. Who are you? Who hired you? The voice chuckled. Let's just say the truth has a way of coming out, Linda. Better prepare yourself. I knew it was Jake. He was upping the ante, trying to isolate me completely. But he underestimated one thing: I wasn't about to back down. I reached out to a friend of mine, Emma, who worked in cybersecurity. I told her everything and asked for her help. Emma dove into the emails, the screenshots, and the so-called evidence. 2 days later, she called me with a breakthrough. Linda, these files were fabricated. Poorly, I might add. The metadata shows they were created on Jake's laptop. I felt a surge of vindication. Can you prove it? Absolutely, she said. Armed with Emma's findings, I confronted Michael again. This time, I didn't just ask him to trust me, I showed him the hard evidence. Michael's face crumpled as he read through Emma's report. Linda, I don't even know what to say. I'm so sorry. Sorry isn't enough, I said, my voice cold. You doubted me. You let Jake manipulate you. And now, I'm the one cleaning up the mess. Michael nodded, shamefaced. I'll fix this. I'll talk to Jake. But I wasn't done. I reached out to Jake myself, arranging to meet him in a public place where he couldn't pull any tricks. When he saw me, his smirk returned. Linda. Didn't expect to see you here. I slid a folder across the table. Your game is over, Jake. I have proof of everything you've done. His expression faltered, but only for a moment. And what are you going to do with it? Show it to Dad? Go ahead. He'll never turn on me. I leaned in, my voice low and steady. I'm not just showing it to Michael. I'm taking this to the police. The color drained from Jake's face. For the first time, he looked genuinely afraid. You wouldn't, he said. Watch me, I replied. This was the turning point. Jake finally admitted to everything, to the lies, the manipulation, even planting the fake evidence. Michael was devastated, but he stood by me as we dealt with the fallout. Jake left for good after that, and while the house was quieter, the scars he left behind were far from healed. But just when I thought it was over, a letter arrived in the mail. No return address, just my name scrawled on the envelope. Inside was a single sentence, "This isn't over. And trust me, what happens next will leave you speechless." Stay tuned, because the twists in this story are far from finished. When I thought I'd seen the worst of Jake's games, the real nightmare began. The letter was chilling enough, but what followed made me question everything I believed about safety, trust, and even myself. You're not ready for what happens next. But trust me, you won't want to look away. The letter didn't have a name, but I knew who it was from. Jake. His handwriting was unmistakable. The single, ominous sentence echoed in my mind, "This isn't over." Michael saw the letter, and for the first time since all this began, he looked genuinely scared. "Do you think he'll come back?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "He's already here. Somewhere. Watching." Michael didn't argue. Instead, he started checking the locks on the doors, the windows, even the garage. But the truth was, locks wouldn't stop Jake. It started small. Strange noises in the middle of the night, footsteps outside the house, the sound of someone tapping on the windows. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced Jake was inside, only to find nothing. Michael began to think I was imagining things. "Linda, maybe it's just stress. After everything, it's understandable." But I knew better. Jake wasn't done with me. He was just getting started. Then came the photos. One morning, I found an envelope in the mailbox. Inside were pictures of me, walking to my car, sitting in the living room, even sleeping. My hands shook as I showed Michael. "This is proof, Michael. He's stalking us." Michael's face turned pale. "We need to call the police." But when the police came, they didn't seem convinced. "Ma'am," the officer said, flipping through the photos. "There's no proof these were taken by your stepson. For all we know, this could be anyone." "Anyone?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Who else would be doing this?" The officer shrugged. "We'll keep an eye out, but there's not much we can do without concrete evidence." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the officer's words, the dismissive tone, the way he acted like I was overreacting. At 3 a.m., I heard it, a soft creak on the stairs. My breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I reached for the baseball bat I'd started keeping by the bed. The floor outside my bedroom door creaked again. I swung the door open, bat in hand. Who's there? I shouted into the darkness. Nothing. Just silence. But as I turned back toward the bed, I saw it, a shadow darting across the hallway. Michael. Wake up. I screamed. He stumbled out of bed, groggy and confused, but by the time we searched the house, the intruder was gone. The next morning, Michael insisted on installing security cameras. I agreed, but deep down, I knew they wouldn't stop Jake. He was too smart, too calculated. Sure enough, the cameras caught nothing, just static and an occasional flicker. Linda, maybe the cameras are malfunctioning, Michael suggested. But I wasn't buying it. Jake was toying with us. Then, one evening, the power went out. I was alone in the house. Michael had gone to the store, and I was sitting in the living room when everything went dark. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. As I moved toward the breaker box, I heard it, a low, guttural laugh coming from the backyard. I froze. Jake? I called out, my voice trembling. No response. Just the sound of leaves rustling. I forced myself to move, stepping outside with the flashlight in hand. The backyard was empty, or so I thought. But then I saw it, a message scrawled in red spray paint across the fence, "You can't hide." When Michael came home, I showed him the message. "This has to stop," he said, his voice shaking. "I'll call Susan. She needs to know what her son is doing." But Susan wasn't much help. "Jake's been with me the whole time," she insisted over the phone. "He hasn't left the house in weeks." Michael hung up, his face a mixture of confusion and frustration. What if she's telling the truth? What if it's not Jake? "It's him," I said firmly. "I can feel it." The next day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I went through Jake's old room, searching for anything that might give me an edge, a clue, a diary, anything. In the back of his closet, I found it, a small, locked box. I pried it open and found a collection of disturbing items, a notebook filled with obsessive drawings of me, scraps of paper with cryptic messages, and a burner phone. The phone had only one contact saved, a number with no name. I called it. "Hello?" a voice answered. It wasn't Jake. It was a woman. The woman claimed to be Jake's therapist. She told me things I wasn't ready to hear, about his past, his issues with control, his dangerous obsession. "He needs help," she said. "But he won't get it willingly. You have to protect yourself." Her words sent chills down my spine. Jake wasn't just a threat to me. He was a ticking time bomb. That night, I confronted Michael. "We can't stay here," I said. "We're not safe." Michael hesitated. "Linda, we can't just run. This is our home." "It's not a home anymore," I said. "It's a trap." As we packed our bags, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jake was watching. Somewhere, in the shadows, he was waiting for his next move. And I knew, whatever came next would be the most dangerous game yet. If you think you've seen it all, think again. The truth about Jake's obsession will leave you speechless. Stay tuned for the next chapter. It's darker, scarier, and more twisted than you can imagine. I sat there in the quiet, staring at the message on my phone, the words on the screen burning into my brain. The text from Jake was simple, just a few words. "I know you want me, Linda. I've seen the way you look at me." My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Was this really happening? Was I trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from? I had tried everything, avoiding him, setting boundaries, even pleading with him to leave me alone. But Jake wouldn't stop. It was like he had somehow figured out how to manipulate the air in our house, making it impossible for me to breathe without him in my space, in my thoughts. The family dinners had become unbearable. Every time I sat at the table, I could feel his eyes on me, even when he wasn't looking directly at me. His presence loomed like a shadow, creeping over everything. I could hear Michael in the kitchen, humming to himself as he prepared dinner. His voice, that comforting sound, felt like a distant echo. I didn't want to tell him. I couldn't risk losing him, especially over something so twisted. But the truth was undeniable. Jake wasn't just making me uncomfortable. He was playing a dangerous game. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending everything was fine. That night, as we sat down for dinner, I caught Jake glancing at me again. His gaze was deliberate, intense, the kind of stare that made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my plate, but his smile, so smug, so sure of himself, haunted me. I felt trapped, my throat tightening, and for a second, I thought I might choke on the food in front of me. After dinner, Michael excused himself to the living room, leaving Jake and me alone in the kitchen. The moment was suffocating. I could feel the weight of his eyes on me, his presence pulling at me like a magnetic force. He walked past me, brushing against my arm. It wasn't an accident. It never was. His touch lingered longer than it should have, and I had to fight the urge to pull away. "Can I help you with anything?" he asked, his voice low, almost too casual. I forced a smile, pretending to be calm, to ignore the churning panic inside. "No, I'm fine. Thanks." But Jake wasn't finished. He moved closer, his breath brushing against my neck as he reached for the plate in my hands. I stepped back, trying to create distance, but he followed. My heart raced as I struggled to keep my composure. "You're always so perfect, Linda," Jake said, his voice laced with something darker now. "You know, I can't help but think, maybe we'd be perfect together." I froze. The world seemed to stop spinning, and my breath caught in my throat. My hands shook, but I couldn't move. His words echoed in my mind, and I realized this wasn't just a crush anymore. This was something calculated. Something dangerous. "Jake," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You need to stop. This isn't right." He smiled, that same twisted smile, and took a step closer. "Why? Because I'm your stepson? Or because you know you can't resist me?" He leaned in, his lips brushing my ear as he whispered, "You know I'm right." My skin crawled, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. Every part of me screamed to run, to get away, but I stayed frozen in place. What was I supposed to do? How could I explain this to Michael without sounding insane? Without making it worse? Before I could say anything more, Jake stepped back, his grin widening. "Don't worry, Linda. I'm patient. You'll come around. Just wait." I watched him leave the kitchen, his words ringing in my ears like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. As the door closed behind him, I sank against the counter, my legs giving way beneath me. This wasn't just a game. Jake was playing with fire, and I was caught in the middle of it. The question was, how far was he willing to go? I knew then that I couldn't let this go on any longer. I had to act. I had to do something, anything, to protect myself, to protect my marriage. But what? Jake had already twisted everything, making me question whether I was losing my mind or if I was the one who was really being targeted. The next day, I did something I had hoped I'd never have to do. I gathered evidence. Texts, photos, even videos. Every little thing I could find that showed what Jake was doing. I knew it was risky, that confronting Michael could tear everything apart, but I couldn't let this go on. I couldn't live like this any longer. I waited for the right moment. It came when Michael was sitting on the couch, reading the newspaper, his attention absorbed in the pages. My hands trembled as I approached him, the evidence on my phone like a weight in my hand. "Michael," I started, my voice shaking. "We need to talk." He looked up, his expression soft. "What's going on, honey?" I've been trying to ignore it, but I can't anymore. "Jake, he's been crossing boundaries. I don't know how to explain it, but I think you need to see this." Michael's face changed, his eyes narrowing as I handed him my phone. He scrolled through the messages, the photos, the videos. As he watched, his face turned pale, his grip tightening around the phone. This is insane, Linda, he muttered, looking up at me with disbelief. I swear, Michael, I didn't ask for this. He's been getting more and more brazen. I don't know what he's planning, but it's not good. Michael stood up, pacing, his hand rubbing his forehead. I don't know what to think. I don't want to believe this. But, these messages. These pictures. I need you to believe me, I said, my voice cracking. I need you to protect me. This isn't just a phase. He's trying to destroy us, Michael. He turned toward me, his eyes filled with confusion and anger. I'll talk to him. I'll figure this out. But deep down, I knew this wasn't going to be easy. Jake had already set his trap, and it was only a matter of time before everything came to a head. The truth was out now, but what would happen next? Would Michael stand by me? Would Jake go even further to ruin everything? The tension was unbearable, and I knew one thing for sure, things were about to get a whole lot worse. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if any of us were going to make it out unscathed. Stay tuned, it's about to get even crazier. I stood there in the middle of the living room, my heart racing, my thoughts a chaotic blur. Michael was pacing back and forth, his eyes burning with disbelief and anger, holding the phone I had given him earlier. The evidence was right in front of him, every text, every photo, every moment that Jake had taken too far. Linda, I don't know what to believe, Michael's voice trembled, strained with a mix of confusion and pain. This isn't like Jake. He's my son, my flesh and blood. You're telling me he's been manipulating you? I could feel the weight of every word hanging in the air, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, to beg him to understand, but the words just wouldn't come. How could I explain this twisted web Jake had woven? How could I make Michael see that this wasn't just some misunderstanding? Jake had crossed a line, many lines, and I could feel myself unraveling in the middle of it all. Michael, please, I said, my voice shaking, I didn't ask for this. I tried to ignore it, tried to make it go away, but he's pushing me into a corner. He's not just a kid with a crush. This is dangerous. Michael stopped pacing and stared at me, his expression shifting from anger to something else, something darker, something I couldn't quite read. His eyes flickered back to the phone in his hand, and I could see him struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with the son he thought he knew. It was as if the world he had built around Jake was crumbling, piece by piece. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Michael asked, his voice suddenly softer, almost defeated. Why wait until now? Because I was afraid, I whispered. Afraid you wouldn't believe me. Afraid it would destroy everything. I felt my chest tighten as the weight of my fear and guilt threatened to crush me. But there was something else, too, a sharp, growing anger. Jake had taken advantage of my fear. He had twisted the situation, manipulated me, made me feel like I was the one who was wrong. And now, I was standing here, fighting for my own sanity, while he was still out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for his next move. Michael sat down on the couch, rubbing his temples. I could tell he was overwhelmed. I didn't blame him. This wasn't something he could just brush aside. His son had betrayed his trust. And I had no idea what would happen next. The sound of footsteps broke through the tension. Jake appeared in the doorway, looking completely unfazed. As if nothing had happened, as if everything was still normal. He flashed a smile that sent a chill through my spine. What's going on here? Jake asked, his voice too casual, too knowing. I could see it now, the smirk on his face, the way he stood there, calm and collected, as if he were in control of the entire situation. He's been planning this. That realization hit me hard, and I could feel my stomach twist in disgust. Jake, we need to talk, Michael said, his voice low and strained. Jake stepped forward, unfazed. About what? What's all the drama about? I could feel the anger building inside me, but I held back. I wasn't going to let him win. Not this time. About you, Michael said, his voice rising, About the way you've been treating Linda. About your lies. Jake's expression shifted, just for a second, only a flicker of something darker in his eyes before he regained control. Lies? What lies? He chuckled, his voice dripping with arrogance. I haven't lied about anything. All I did was care for Linda. She's the one who's been making things awkward. The nerve of him. My blood boiled, and I couldn't hold back anymore. You think I'm the one making things awkward? You've been stalking me, sending me creepy messages, making me feel unsafe in my own home. I shouted, my voice raw with emotion. You've been playing games with me, Jake. And you've manipulated your father into thinking I'm the problem. Michael looked at me, his eyes wide in disbelief. Is this true, Jake? He asked, his voice shaking with anger. Jake didn't even flinch. Instead, he crossed his arms over his chest, a smug look still plastered on his face. What's your point, Linda? He asked, his voice so cold it sent a shiver down my spine. You think I'm some sort of monster? You think I'm crazy? You're the one who's out of control here. I was shaking, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. You've been lying to him, manipulating him, and now you're turning this around on me? You're sick, Jake. Michael's face was pale, his expression torn between disbelief and fury. I don't know who you are anymore, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to believe. And then, just as I thought the room couldn't get more suffocating, Jake dropped the bombshell. You want the truth? He asked, his voice suddenly quieter, more serious. Okay, here it is, everything I've done, every move I've made, it's been to test you, Linda. To see how far you'd go. I wanted to know if you'd be like everyone else, just pretending. Pretending to be someone you're not. I stared at him, my mind reeling. What was he saying? This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about him, about his sick, twisted game. Test me? I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. You've been playing me this entire time? Jake nodded, a dark smile curling on his lips. You think Michael's going to believe you over me? I'm his son. You're just his wife. And in the end, he'll always choose me. He has to. My heart sank as I realized just how deep this went. This wasn't just a son's crush or an innocent mistake. This was a calculated plan. A power play. And I had fallen into his trap. Michael was silent, his eyes flicking between Jake and me, trying to process the chaos that had erupted in his living room. His face was pale, his jaw clenched as the truth settled in. I could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to believe Jake. He had to. But what if everything I had told him was the truth? What if Jake had been playing a dangerous game all along? The air in the room felt electric with tension. And as I looked at Michael, I knew something had changed. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about his entire world being shattered. His son had crossed a line that might never be uncrossed. As Michael stood there, silent, torn between his loyalty to his son and the woman he loved, I knew one thing for certain, the game had only just begun. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if either of us were going to win. Stay tuned, it's about to get even more twisted. I could hardly breathe as I stared at Jake, my mind racing, my heart pounding. What he just said sent a cold shiver down my spine, and it felt as though the ground beneath me was slipping away. His words weren't just a confession, they were a threat, a warning. He had played me from the start, and now I was caught in a game I wasn't sure I could win. Linda, Jake said again, his voice smooth and almost too calm. You've been so easy to manipulate. I knew the moment you walked into this house that you were weak. That you'd crack under pressure. And guess what? You did. My mouth went dry. I had never seen him like this. This wasn't the sweet, innocent boy who had once called me stepmom. This was someone entirely different, someone far more dangerous. I tried to make sense of it, tried to fight the panic that was rising inside me. But the reality was setting in. Jake had planned this whole thing, carefully orchestrating every move, every word, every look, just to see how far he could push me. And now, he was playing the final hand. I turned to Michael, desperate for his support, but when I saw his face, it felt like a slap in the face. He wasn't looking at me with the same understanding, the same protective love he once had. His eyes were filled with doubt, his jaw tight with uncertainty. I could see the wheels turning in his head, processing everything I had just revealed, and I couldn't help but feel utterly alone. "Michael," I pleaded, my voice trembling, "please, you have to see what he's done. He's been manipulating me. He's been lying to you. This isn't just about a crush, it's about control, power. I'm not crazy, I swear." But Michael didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned his gaze back to Jake, his son, who stood there with an infuriatingly smug expression. The tension in the room was suffocating. It felt like time had slowed, every second stretching on forever, as I waited for Michael's next words. What would he say? What would he do? Could he still believe in me after everything that had happened? Finally, Michael spoke, his voice hoarse, strained. "Jake, is this true? Have you been manipulating Linda? Is everything she said really what's been going on?" I saw Jake's face flicker for just a moment, like he was trying to keep up the act. But then, with a sharp laugh, he leaned back against the wall, looking far too relaxed for someone who'd just been accused of such a terrible thing. "Manipulating her?" Jake repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've got it all wrong, Dad. I've just been testing the waters. Seeing if she's the right fit for this family. You know how it is. Some people just don't belong, no matter how hard they try to fit in." It felt like a slap to the face. The audacity of him. To sit there, so calm, so collected, as if everything he'd done was just a test. I was stunned. This was no longer about a misunderstood crush. This was about something much darker, much more calculated. And as much as I wanted to fight back, I could feel the weight of Michael's gaze on me, filled with doubt. "No," I breathed, shaking my head. "You've crossed a line, Jake. You're not just testing anything. You've been lying, playing with me, twisting everything so that it looks like I'm the bad guy. You're the one who's made this into a game." Jake's lips curled into a smile, and for a moment, I almost thought I saw a flicker of admiration in his eyes. Like he was impressed by his own manipulations. "You really think I've been playing games?" he asked, his tone mocking. "This is real life, Linda. And in real life, people like you, they're just temporary. I've been trying to show you that. Trying to show you your place." I could feel the anger boiling inside me, threatening to spill over. He had played with my emotions, my trust, everything I had tried to build in this family. But now, it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about Michael too, his loyalty to his son, the person he thought he knew so well. And the more I looked at Michael, the more I realized that there was no way back. The damage had been done. "I'm not just temporary, Jake," I said, my voice steadying. "I'm your stepmother. I'm part of this family, and I'm not going anywhere. You don't get to control me. You don't get to twist everything to your advantage." Michael's eyes flickered between us, his face a mixture of disbelief and confusion. "Linda," he began, his voice soft, "I don't know what to think. This is all so much." "I know it's a lot, Michael," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I need you to understand. You need to choose. This isn't about me versus Jake. This is about what kind of family we want to be. Do you want to believe me or him?" There was a long silence. Jake stood there, watching us, his smug expression never faltering. But there was something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. It was almost like he knew the storm that was coming, like he was waiting for it. Michael looked torn, his eyes darting back and forth between Jake and me. "I don't want to lose my son, Linda," he said, his voice breaking. I could feel my heart shatter as I realized the depth of the struggle he was facing. But the truth was, this wasn't about losing a son. It was about protecting the life we had built together, about standing up against manipulation and lies. And I knew, deep down, that I couldn't just stand by and let Jake tear us apart. You have to make a choice, Michael, I said, my voice firm now. Do you want a family, or do you want a son who's willing to destroy everything just to get his way? The tension was unbearable. I could feel the weight of Michael's decision hanging in the air, and as the seconds ticked by, I realized something. This wasn't just the end of my relationship with Jake. This was the end of everything we had built, and everything we could have been. And then, just as I thought the nightmare would never end, Jake took one last step forward. You're right, Linda, he said, his voice dangerously calm. This isn't over. It's just beginning.